Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Terry Dorsey, and I am the Senior Data Architect and Evangelist for North America for Denodo. But a little bit about my history. I came out of industry. I spent 40 years in industry. And more recently, a good couple of decades at a global CPG/manufacturing company, where I'm going to try to relate some of my experiences and some of my observations from my stint there during this discussion as well. And if there are any questions, feel free to just ask them. So what I'm going to talk about in line with this topic of beyond data integration and unification and the rise of generative AI, and what I mean by that is it's set a lot of things in motion. Just this idea that AI became so accessible almost overnight. This idea around being able to leverage it, it just sets so many things in motion around how we were going to look at our data architecture and how we were actually going to not only just support generative AI, but other things in our organization. So I'm going to talk about what the things that we want to do in our organizations, why it's so hard, why there are challenges today, but I think everybody else probably has a good idea as to the why. I'm going to go on a little bit about how we think about satisfying some of those objectives today, and I'm going to hopefully introduce, to some it may not be an introduction, but a different perspective as to how to think about how we actually deliver information and support objectives like generative AI. And just some examples of what that looks like. So when we talk about the things that we want to do, everybody wants to be into this space of artificial intelligence, generative AI, and all of the advanced things that go with it, autonomous agents. And I think we all realize that underlying, or the things that are the underpinning for that, are data and how we actually have to move it within our organizations. But there are still a lot of challenges that we still face today around reporting and dashboards. They're not dead yet. I mean, maybe within the next year or two they may be dead, but we still have the needs to actually support these types of efforts, as well as integration, planning, and application development. All of these things too, I think they're almost forgotten in the fact that they still need data in order for them to operate as well. The concept of data-driven decisions and analysis all the way out to the actual end business user are things that are very desirable in organizations today. I know it was for the organization that I came from. And the idea of sharing information to our external partners, and even within different organizations that are part of larger global footprints, or even ones that are within our country, or even within regions. And so a lot of these objectives we still have to satisfy today. And the idea is, how do we actually get there? And so when we think of all of the challenges around that, I've actually kind of grouped them into four different areas. And I actually got this from an article that talked about this subject and the challenges that maybe higher education organizations have. But I think this translates across all industries and wellness. This idea of the general lack of availability of information. This one in number two in particular, this separation of, or mismatch of, belief versus reality. And what that means is, it can mean a lot of things, but a couple things could mean that, IT and technology has their way of thinking about things and how things should be. And then the business actually has, their challenges around growing the business, doing business things. And a lot of times they're running along parallel paths. Because there's not enough crossover in order to get there. Increased costs and work. Our organizations are getting more and more complicated. Our data landscapes are spread out in many places. In some instances, multiple clouds and on-premise. So things are just more complicated. Applications are moving in and out. Initiatives are changing throughout the organization. And getting our arms around that has just been very difficult. And it's not something new. It's something that's been a challenge for, I'm going to say, about 30, 40 years, at least from my personal experience. And then finally, there's this idea of aims, where we want to go, where we want to do, and how we want to govern it, and what governance even means. And so, when I think about some of the challenges that I faced, specifically when I was with McCormick, in and around the time of 2016, 2017, we embarked on an artificial intelligence project that was not only strategic, but I'm going to say pervasive, in that we had to rely on information from all across the enterprise in order to meet that objective. And meanwhile, during that time, and everyone can probably remember back in that time frame, this was the time where people were starting moving stuff to the clouds, and SaaS applications were popping up here and there, and a lot of our business users were adopting them, and IT was adopting them. So the pace of innovation, the pace of change and volatility in our landscapes, and particularly some of the things that we face were globalization challenges, time zones, things that you probably typically don't think about in a lot of instances until you run into them. IP protection was a big deal for us. Certain information in our organization, we had firewalls even between parts of the organizations, let alone internal and external. And transformations, right? So I think I heard discussion in the previous discussion, we were talking about SAP migrations being multi-year and forever years. I think we might have had some terms that had never in the word for some of those. But this idea that things are multi-year, and some of these things, these initiatives are going on at the same time. And so if you're in a position where you have to manage a data landscape, it is very, very challenging. Particularly if we look at our approach to it. And so, the goals that I gave to myself specifically were how do I make sure that I support this? How can I make sure that, I embark on this, very aggressive initiative and make sure that I can keep up agility and inject some stabilization, even though the environment that we were working with was just so chaotic. And so what happened for us, and around that same time, there was an enterprise data architecture, enterprise architecture initiative that was coming. That was being put into place. Typically with enterprise architecture, there's a lot of this idea of drawing and documenting things, but there was this idea we wanted it to be active. We wanted to make sure that what we actually worked on in that space was something that we could translate through the organization so that we can lift up all of those initiatives and all of the consumers of those initiatives at the same time. And so there was this idea, it became very simple, right? The vision now is, okay, how can everyone find what they need? How can sharing of that information be easy but secure at the same time? How can we integrate things easily and everything compliant, right? And the idea is this, I think this is a vision that a lot of us have. But the question is, how do we start on that quest towards gaining that vision? And so to do that, we took a different perspective. And that perspective, now we're in the enterprise architecture discipline. So now we got to look back and we have to look at what the design principles are. And there are some basic ones that everybody uses. Manufacturers use them, restaurants use them, manufacturers, product, everybody uses them. And there's this idea of, these 4 ideas here are the ones that we paid especially close attention to. And the first one is separating concerns, right? So a lot of times when we approach initiatives, we kind of conflate things and we try to do everything along these paths or these monoliths. And this idea of separating concerns means that you break up your problems into simple problems. And then the resolution from those problems, there's interaction between those and how they work. And this works for technology, processes, and many things. Abstracting of complexity means that if you want people to have access to information to do those things, you have to simplify how they actually interact with it. Generalization means that you want to be able to create something that you're going to get value, and in value in the data space is reuse. Reuse, and the more reuse you get, the more value that thing brings. And then finally, loosely coupling, where you separate things so that if you change something, it doesn't affect the whole, right? Think of a car. You can change your tire, but the car is still good, most of them. But the car still runs. Right, and so there's the idea of if you apply these principles, what can they do for you as far as delivering information in an organization? And it turns out that fundamentally what they do, and what I have seen them firsthand do, is you have improved maintainability. And we'll go into some architecture and how that actually works its way out. Increased reusability. you can now scale not only systems. A lot of times when we think about scaling, we think about technology and technology moving faster and being able to move volumes of information. But some of the things that make or break implementations are the processes that actually have to happen around them. And if you build things where the processes are very cumbersome and very difficult, then a lot of implementations will fail. And you also end up with a lot of costs as well, and you actually end up increasing complexity in the process as well. And finally, there's this idea of being able to create things faster. Because if you can follow these principles, it's not just one team that's creating things. It's now the whole of the organization that has the ability to actually go in and do the things that they need to do. And they may not be structured, right? Different people for different initiatives want to do different things at different times. This is the world that we're in when we think about data consumption, particularly. And so what I'm going to concentrate on is the concern of delivering information to meet those objectives. Keep in mind that when we created our architecture, there was a data component, which I'm going to focus on here today. But there were other components like moving, messaging, as well as security around the infrastructure itself. And so the idea is to separate things out and treat the problem as a separate component and make it so that you can interact with that component of your enterprise. And so at the bottom, we have a lot of our systems. And that's the idea here. The truth, the thing that does not change is the fact that this changes every day, almost. And if you're in global organizations, sometimes it could be multiple things that are happening at any one period of time. And I think we all realize that when we try to do delivery at this lower level, I mean, if I were to look back 30 years ago, that's basically what we did. People were accessing systems and it was a mess then. And we had this idea around shadow IT and all of the problems that generated. So I think that we all can agree that if we try to do it at this level, it's really not effective and it's very, very expensive, time, resources, effort, and everything. But what I see we do today, and certainly what we did for, I'm going to say, the better part of the 130-year history of our company, was that we would create all these architected products across the organization, and those would come down from different efforts. And so the analogy is kind of like when you go to a restaurant. The scenario that we would have replicated is that we have multiple waiters, and that waiter does everything. He takes your order, he makes your food, he brings it out, and he does everything. And imagine a bunch of them and what things look like. And I think that's the approach that we typically took, at least we did, in our organization for a very long time. And when you do that, you end up with myriad of problems, inconsistent security, you have much redundancy, and a lot of just chaos. And I think a lot of us could probably identify with that type of scenario today. To add to that, and I'm speaking for my organizations and some of the organizations of customers that I do speak to, we've also even divided it further where we have different efforts in our organization that are going after the same information, and a lot of times in the same way. It's just a different realization of what it is. We have application development, and if you're doing an integration with ERP, you have people that are going to do stuff there, and you end up with all of this debt. And a lot of times we get in these situations and we don't even realize where that debt, how we actually amass all this debt. And it's not just the debt of systems, it's now the debt of processes and replication and all of this chaos within our organization. And so the idea is if I apply design principles to that, how do I cut through that? Now, the idea from the data delivery side is the idea that we abstract. So now we're bringing in abstraction where, what if we could abstract the enterprise? What if we create entities in our enterprise that were representations of our enterprise? What would that mean for the myriad of consumers that we actually want to support? And if those were now grounded in some area where people could now work and deploy. And what we realized was there is a sweet spot here. And that sweet spot gives you consistent security. You can control the volume of assets and things that you need to maintain and deploy, quality control, change control. All these things become simpler when we start componentizing an abstraction of the enterprise. So what that looks like from a separated concerns now is like we have our enterprises, they drive our business, they can move out and move out however they want to. We now have these architected products that are based off of our component products. And in some instances, it doesn't even matter how they're actually leveraged. Those are different processes or different guidelines or policies. Now we're in the place of use policies, not in delivery policies. And actually, this worked well for us. The project that we were working on, we started in 2017, and this was before MLOps people. So we started in 2017 on our initiatives. We were working with a third party, artificial intelligence, because at the time that was quite a premium to get artificial intelligence experts in. And we certainly did not have, we weren't on the cloud. I think the cloud was emerging, at that period of time. And so the idea was how do we embark into this product where we're going to change the way our product development organization operated, and for them to leverage AI to do that. And how do we now get information to these third-party researchers in a timely fashion that was consistent so that we could stabilize that investment? Because you can imagine that, first of all, these projects in themselves become iterative, but because the organization is still changing, we had to do it in a way such that we didn't have to re-architect or recreate or remodel or manufacture or develop the things that they were doing. And we certainly did not want, I think the gentleman before said it, typically it's 33% effort towards artificial intelligence and 67% for data delivery. And if you're bringing in a third party to do that, that's just not really good. That's not good a situation to be in. So the idea is, how do we now do that? And there's this idea that when we do this within these entities and we leverage them and we do all of these things around design principles, that we can make that happen. And this is where the logical data fabric kind of fits into that. And there's this idea of doing all of this work within this logical layer to facilitate that. So what does that look like? So when we talk about enterprise entities, for instance, customer would be one, or a sales order, or a process order, or an employee. These are entities that everybody understands. And when we think about it, even when we do logic and business logic, we talk about it in terms of these entities. And so this idea is, why not abstract the entities and let people work off these abstractions? And so I can build this customer and I can use very, very good design and process principles around the development and build of now these enterprise entities, right? So I can actually design it. What does a customer look like? Well, a customer has these attributes, and these attributes, and this one is named this, and these are the descriptions of this attribute. And for internal people, maybe your account manager, you can see yours, and maybe if you're external, you can see yourself. So these ideas now become something that we're now talking in terms of the business. And this is how we worked with our AI researchers. We're now in a space where we can talk to them and deliver information based on business terms and principles. That means they can now understand it and they can apply it in the artificial intelligence space. We can also have protocols that we could dictate how we could actually interact with them. And how we were actually going to leverage the security for those attributes. Which identities, which attributes those identity have. We can now manage that in an English or a business-like way in order to give security to that. We can produce it. So now the enterprise and all of that ever-changing data landscape becomes almost like raw materials for these component products. And I can build this customer entity basically any way I want. I can determine where the source is, where the attributes are coming from, and I can do that logically in that layer. I can do quality control and testing. So one thing I learned, and I spent about a decade or so in BI, is that even when we did the transformations that we did with BI, we would still start with entities, and then we would just build the rules based on these entities. And so the idea now becomes, I can test this entity. And this entity, if this entity reflects a customer and the attributes of that customer, I can even have the business do that validation for it. And that means I'm starting on a very solid foundation when I want to leverage this entity. Compliance. when I run any derivative of products from this customer through the data fabric, I know every time it's executed, every time the information is taken from it. And so I can now get an idea of how my use is and the value of my entity. Change control, I can add attributes to my customer. And anything that's based on that customer, it doesn't break because I haven't really changed what that customer looked like. I haven't changed data types or haven't changed. I'm adding attributes for it so I can get this into a CI/CD process, and I have a better control of the dependencies around when I have to notify who. I know who's using it based on if I make changes that are going to require that. And what we found that many of the changes that we were making were additions of attributes. And so a lot of times we could add attributes and things and there would be no downstream repercussions for doing that. And now, when I think about scaling and things like that, now I'm focusing on what are my usage policies for how people are going to use things. What's my methodology or my specification of what my products now look like? So for instance, for customer, I don't want to just have IDs. Maybe I want the names, and maybe I want to decide that all my products will have a different type of form and structure. I can now focus on that because I know that when people want to use things, consistency and simplification really matters. I can now have patterns around my usage for integration, for AI, for planning. I can now implement patterns. And for us, even when third parties came in to do development, they would have to leverage those patterns because now I'm in a space where I'm kind of like in control of what I'm doing, what I'm giving to people, and I have governance around how I'm actually delivering data and how people are working with it. And these are typically the places where I find that a lot of customers run into challenges because we get into this architected frame of mind where we build these monoliths that have to move together or have to have all these dependencies built into them, that a lot of times their projects fail or they end up in situations where it's very expensive to actually work. And so what does that look like when I actually do it? And I took this example. This is a subset of the design that we had within our data fabric. And so what we would do, and this actually started with the artificial intelligence project. We could, whatever we needed, we would create those abstractions. And we knew that we could reuse them for other things. So if I had an integration come in, I could create abstractions. If I had an analytic thing come in, I could create these abstractions. And so I could just build things within my logical data fabric. So I can build a delivery, an employee. And it was really quite interesting because when I used to talk, when I was in BI, I had a lot of interaction with customers, a lot of cycles. And some of the basic things that they would say is like, well, why do I have to go through this process? Can't you just give me this? Or can you just give me that? And we kind of like took that as a lesson that in order for people to be able to innovate and explore, they have to have access to something to work with. And these long cycles, a lot of times these long cycles were people exploring within these long cycles. So the idea is like, give them the enterprise, let them explore safely. So we could create these entities. And what that would look like is, for instance, I could pull attributes from Salesforce. I can pull attributes. We had multiple ERPs. We could pull attributes from multiple ERPs or an MDM or whatever. I could design how I sourced that customer. If I had inventory information, I could pull it out of my ERP. I could merge from my ERP, my live systems, with my historical systems. So I could actually have a sales orders that had real time and historical, but that sales order or whatever was still something that was a representation that was usable. And so I could build these objects that had purpose, that they could be used for real-time goals or uses versus our analytic uses. And I could govern how I source them based on cost, right? So if I had like one attribute or whatever that's not highly used, I'm not going to spend a lot of time merging and wrangling data to build that. If something didn't need real-time information, if something didn't need heavily processed and transformation, I'm now in control of what I'm delivering, how I'm delivering it, and at what costs, and based on its usage and its value to the organization. I could then secure each of these based on enterprise determined security for these objects. For anybody in the manufacturing business will know that when you have a bill of material, there's a lot of security around that. So I could secure that differently from maybe customers or raw materials. And each of these are now in the business terms. And so what that means is I can offload the security to business users as well. Right? And so a lot of these things I could do, at their enterprise level. I could now control what my footprint is. We also had managed services, and I don't know how many of you actually have managers or third-party support. What that means is as you build artifacts and things, your price for support typically goes up because you have more and more things that you're now supporting. So those costs could also be controlled. Additionally, I can dictate or determine how all of these things were related in the virtual or in this virtual space. And once I do that, all of this management here, I've now made this available for many types of use cases or consumers in my organization. So when a lot of these same attributes we created, we could have data scientists that could then go do other things and create other products. So for instance, if I wanted to know how many, what my shorted orders were, I could join deliveries with my sales orders and I can determine what my shortages are. They could do them ad hoc if those things didn't exist. People could then create them and share them out, based on that. And when we look at lineage, we're looking at lineages down to these governed assets. I mean, you can certainly go further, but now it kind of makes sense as to how these rules are actually applied. Some other things that I could do, and I could also create REST services that I can now leverage for integrations, external sharing off of these same based objects. I could develop a REST service that had the structure of what a manufacturing material or a sales order looked like. And all of these are running through my component objects. And so what that means is that anybody that has SQL access now has access to my enterprise based on their security, and anything that executes as well has access based on their security. And all of this can be packaged within or governed by an identity provider, right? And so what that means is I could run this part of my data delivery with a very, very tight group of people. And we could deliver a lot of value to the enterprise by managing these products. And some of the things that we did do, right? We had integration patterns, and these were real-time integration patterns. So we could leverage services based off events, small events. Now, typically the way people do enterprise integration is they'll go in and they'll do a lot of source work. And if you're in SAP and you have multiple ones, you'll repeat that X number of times. And you'll pray that, when something changes, you can synchronize across all those systems. Well, why not just call one service and maintain that service that's maintained through these products? And imagine how that now simplifies how integration works. Financial planning, demand planning, materials planning, just about every planning that a manufacturing company can do, they now have access to. I don't have it on here, but there were journal entries. That was an object. We have product hierarchy. So all these things now become something that instead of me having to go through, I think we were going through a warehouse at one point to build all of these, I can now offload it. And all of that experimentation and work can be done based on the business users that are going to end up giving me the requirements anyway. AI, that particular AI project, we were, after 1 year, because our contracts were 1 year at a time, after the first year, we were fully deployed with a user interface, over 500 models that were acquiring information from our enterprise 24/7. And when we pitted that AI against our product developers, 2 out of 3 of those products were liked better. And so that means that we were able to get that foundation in place following this type of architecture. And why? Because our AI researchers were 100% dedicated on AI. So we could turn we were doing a lot of iterations. That project is still living and breathing and evolving today, and that is through cloud migrations. An SAP migration that started in 2019 is going on today. And there have been no updates from the delivery side. They still work with that common interface. So no matter how the organization has changed, we don't have to reinvest in what we had invested in to begin with. Analytics. So not only do we have reporting and stuff that runs off of it, but now our data scientists can now model, and they can produce metrics and dashboards for their community that they can deploy. Oh, and when they execute it, it goes through the security framework that we have here. Exploration. Not only can analysts explore, but now if you were to come in through the data catalog, there's a part of the data fabric where you can now ask questions of these entities based on their relationship, and get responses back based on natural query generation within the platform itself. So this is what it looks like when you look at the internal workings of it. And so what that means is that customer object that was secured, I now have all of these different types of consumers that can interact with it: orders, deliveries, invoices, inventory, shipments, all things in the enterprise in all types of combinations, be they governed for IT or be they produced and governed within the business itself. And so if we look at the idea of shipments and things around shipments, what does this look like from an end user? So I have an application developer, right? And maybe this application developer was asked to create a chat application for customer service. And so with the ability to do text to SQL generation, we can now see that based on my entities and their relationships, the generation of those queries are simplified, regardless of how extensive my organization is. In our case, it was a global organization. So that means that they can leverage the customer's deliveries and the invoices. They can either join them together or they can actually reference them and use an SDK that now has this generalized access to the enterprise for metadata as well as execution. So I, as an application developer, can concentrate on application development instead of data wrangling and data engineering. That is taken care of by my enterprise and all of my governance and all of my security. And I, as an application developer, know that when I write it, that part is something that has been monitored and blessed by the enterprise. Customer service. Maybe they get a lot of requests about, for instance, delayed shipments or things like that. And their outcomes is they can be more responsive to their customers. And there are a few options where they can do that, right? So if somebody built a visualization tool sitting on top of that, then they can go and run that report and look at it. But they can also go to the data catalog and ask the question about the shipment to that data catalog. You can also execute it ad hoc within the catalog, or use the chatbot that your application developers created based on those entities. The occasional business user might be out at a client site and the client's asking him a question and he's like, what? I don't even know what you're talking about, but let me go see. Let me use a chat application that was created. Maybe I have access to a report, but if I don't, I can go and ask the catalog, what happened to this customer shipment? And the beauty of that is, if I ask questions, it's only my customers that I'm now even going to have access to. So I have access to information around all of my customers that comes from this abstraction of my enterprise. A data scientist, well, they may want to do some type of study of buy-in patterns for customers. We don't care. The idea is that they can now go in and pick the things, entities, and attributes and features from these parts of the enterprise, and they can build either views. You can now, if you want, you can actually create pipelines based off of these objects. You can materialize those views, and you can actually feed those through services directly into your machine learning projects. Whichever capabilities those data scientists have, they can make use of those entities from the enterprise. Similarly with data science who wants to predict shipments delays, all of this information from the enterprise is now available through a consistent means of access. Not only of where it is, but how I actually interact with it. Integration developers, historically, a lot of our integrations were batch-based, and we're writing all of this, and and even when messaging and buses were brought in, a lot of times that data acquisition would be in the responsibility of the integration developers. Well, my integration developers had their concerns separated. If I'm an integration bus developer, you know what? Just worry about guaranteed delivery, error handling, and when it comes to information, leverage what has already been done for you within the enterprise. So now they can focus on just, managing the streamlined development process now, right? They can manage the queues and the error handling and retries, and all of that can be done just by pulling services based off of these abstractions of the enterprise. And so, hopefully you can get a feel for what that means as far as how you can quickly provide value to the enterprise. And the beauty of it, this outcome didn't even grow overnight. It could grow as the needs come in. So, the philosophy was, as assignments came in, we could deconstruct them into the components that were necessary, and then we would build off of those components, because now those components are available for the rest of the enterprise to take advantage of. And so fundamentally, I think we can see across all of the things that we want to do in our enterprise is that many of those initiatives require the same thing, the same type of information from the same places. And if we do them each separately, we create this type of rework and chaos within our enterprise, which allows us, which means that we can no longer focus on user wants, because we're now in the day-to-day of trying to relive or redo things that have changed in our enterprise. And if we base our approach based on design principles and specifically prioritize reuse, we can see how we can make gains to do that. And for me, I went looking for a logical data fabric, because when they came to me and said that they wanted to do a project of such magnitude, I could only imagine myself trying to do that through traditional means, and what that meant, and how that would restrict the growth of that product. Because we've also seen how it happens with integration and other things that happen within our enterprise, a heavy customization in our source systems, and just all of the debt that we bring when we look to satisfy requests. So the idea is now, how can we leverage the work that we do so that we're not in that place? We can actually do the business of doing business instead of doing the business of repeating the same thing over and over again within our enterprise. And a logical data fabric facilitates that. To provide information not only for those initiatives, for anybody. Anybody can come to the data fabric and get information about what's some of the components of your enterprise through the data fabric. That's kind of all I have today. Are there any questions that anybody would have here?
When you were creating the entities like the shipment product and the customer product, who was involved in creating it?
Right. So depending upon what the objects were, it was different parts of the enterprise. What I found and what I observed, and not only just within my organization, but in some of the organizations of the customers that I talk to, is that your BI and your data, a lot of times they know where the bases are for those things. And so a lot of the creation of those things can be done, or can be mostly designed through them. When it came to the securing of those entities, we also found that each of those entities, they have a life cycle of how their security evolves. And so what we were allowed to do is to buy into that. So for instance, a formula, everybody knew how you had to protect formulas because we own formulas that didn't belong to us. And so there was a governance policy around how they could be deployed. So that one done. We find that with human resources, it's a little bit more complicated. And so human resource objects would have, it's almost an inverse, right? So if you want full deployment, you have to understand what the granular rules are. If you want a limited deployment, but you still get a deployment, you can have things more broader. So it can just be, you had to be in HR, and you had to be a certain person in HR, or you could go down to regional levels. Knowing that once people start to get access to information, that means that their drive and their desire, because they want to get access to that information, is to now come in and help to refine that. And so even if you start with broader security, lower deployment, you can actually migrate or roadmap yourself into broader deployment with more granular security. Yeah.
My boss doesn't want to buy new software without me giving him an ROI on it. How would you put a dollar amount to what you guys did?
Right. So typically, and I think a lot of organizations, the funding model is really sometimes makes that activity difficult. What I would often do is, particularly in the integration space, there is a cost for integration, either it's time or value. Well, in some instances, some of our integrations didn't cost anything because the APIs and those products were already created. Now, typically, what would happen is if I'm going to now create some type of estimate for another project, I'm not going to think about it, right? So I'm not going to include it in. So cost avoidance is something I'm not thinking about. So I guess I say so organizationally, I think it's hard to answer that. But I think if you make the argument, but the argument can be made that, given this scenario, I don't have to do this. I'm bringing these APIs. And that's actually what we ended up doing. Just like a software company has APIs of how they actually interact with your software, we now are in this position where you have APIs of how you actually interact with your organization. And now that argument can be made that cost avoidance is very high. I can only imagine that if I had taken the traditional route when I was working with my external artificial intelligence resources, I don't know that we would have had anything completed within a year. I think that the cost in that, instead of getting value after that first year, because in 2019 products were sold based off of that, that means 2 years. Normally, I think that would have been pushed out. So I think some of it is being able to make the argument of what cost avoidance looks like, what the cost of doing business going forward is going to look like, because a lot of the funding models just don't make it as transparent. Typically, you have a project, you build it, and then it gets passed off, and somebody else has to support it. And those costs for that typically don't get captured. So I think you just have to be good at trying to figure out how to make that case and how to make that argument. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything in particular about generative AI that might affect that logical data fabric in terms of maybe the unstructured data doesn't correspond to the particular entities, the tabular data?
That is fair, right? So typically, the scenario that is the sweet spot here is one of text to SQL generation. Because when you talk about unstructured data, there's a different mentality about how you retrieve. Fundamentally, it turns into structured in a vector database, but that maybe you could have a vector database that represent a body of documents, another vector database that represents another body of documents, and those can be either union or intersected through a data fabric. The sweet spot here is with your core enterprise and things that actually run your business, right? And when you think about it, when we were doing ours, we use very little unstructured data because most of the stuff that actually runs our business is in our core systems. And the power behind using natural language to SQL is that you now get analytic capabilities through generative AI, right? And so think of the questions that you can ask now that you can actually get through generated SQL as opposed to what you can get when you generate questions based off of semantic similarity in documents, right? So when you put the power of those two things together, you have the power of the enterprise and the power of your documents behind you. You can have different categories of vectorization of documents within the enterprise and still leverage those through the enterprise as well, because at that point it's structured, because it's vectorized. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, multiple vector databases.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, or even in the same database, I think some of the metadata can be separated off, right? So the beauty about the technology is that I can even have the same table and I can create multiple entities from it based off of different filters or different projections that I can make.
Yeah, I think how it works with traditional table data, I see certainly is use case for that, where it's really just translating and then like query to SQL query, right? But that's hitting SQL database.
Correct, but virtual databases and graph databases can be virtualized as well. Right, I mean, vector databases can be virtualized as well. And so the vector data, the query is now find me something close to this point, right? This multi-dimensional point, find me something close to it. And similarly with graph databases, that's basically a graph query. Yeah.
So if you're using, let's say, natural language processing to get the information from all these objects and everything, whether it's a vector database, structured or unstructured, and then you get the final results, the report, or whatever it is, and you present it, and they say, okay, how did you get these numbers? How do you recreate it to show them, well, this is how it was done to get at this particular number? So
right. Yeah. So within the catalog, the implementation within the catalog is when you ask a question, what comes back is the SQL query that's actually generated and an explanation of that query along with the output from that query within the catalog. If you do it through an application that you create, what you get here is the generalized access to the metadata and the generalized access to execution, but you're now in the driver's seat of how you actually implement that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and let's just say if I do this natural language query or whatever, and I have the results back, I like it, can we save that? Like, or is that information cached if I want to see more information to develop the
Right, you can download it in a spreadsheet. You can generate a view from that query that was generated as well. Are there any other questions? All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks.